The morning Margaret Keller folded her last quilt, the one stitched from her wedding dress and her dead husband's shirts, she understood with a cold and clarifying certainty that she had nothing left to lose, and that was the most dangerous kind of freedom a woman could possess in the year 1872. She stood at the edge of the Missouri River town of Independence, where the air smelled of mud and horse sweat, and the particular desperation of people who had already sold everything they owned. The quilt was heavy in her arms, a patchwork of ivory silk and blue flannel, of Sunday mornings and winter evenings, of a life that had been hers and then, one terrible February, had ceased to be. Her husband, Thomas Keller, had died of a fever that swept through their farm outside of Columbus, Ohio, and he had taken with him not only his warmth and his laugh and his steady hands, but also everything practical, the deed to the land, the creditors who came knocking, the slow erosion of what little security she had believed to be permanent. She was 31 years old, with dark hair she kept pinned tight, gray eyes that had cried themselves dry sometime in March, and a stubbornness that her mother had always called a flaw and that had lately revealed itself as the thing keeping her alive. Independence was the starting point, everyone said, the jumping-off place. If you were heading west in 1872, if you had heard the whispers about land in Oregon or the promises of California or the new territories opening like wounds in the map, you came first to Independence. You found a wagon company. You found a guide. You found, if you had the means, a place among the train. Margaret had no means. She had the quilt. She had traveled to Independence by rail from Columbus, selling Thomas's tools at each stop, bartering her silver hairbrush at one station and her spare pair of boots at another, arriving in Missouri with 37 cents and the quilt and the clothes on her back. She had one carpet bag. She had a letter from her sister in Oregon, a sister named Ruth who had married a farmer named Harold Briggs 3 years prior, and who had written, in handwriting that slanted urgently across the page, that there was room in Oregon for a woman who was willing to work. Margaret intended to be willing to work. She had never been anything but. The wagon yard near the south edge of Independence was loud with the sounds of early spring oxen complaining, children crying, men arguing about axle grease and departure schedules. Women moved between the wagons with the purposeful efficiency of people who had long since abandoned anything that was not essential. Margaret had never joined a wagon train before. She had never traveled further west than Pittsburgh. She stood at the edge of the yard and watched the organized chaos with a careful eye, looking for the man who was said to be taking on passengers. His name, she had been told by the woman at the boarding house where she'd spent her last night, was Hector Malone. He ran one of the larger trains, 15 wagons strong, heading northwest toward Fort Laramie and beyond. He charged $15 a head for passage, and he was the cheapest reputable guide out of Independence that spring. $15. Margaret had 37 cents and one quilt. She found Hector Malone beside a wagon with a broken wheel. He was a thick man with a red beard and small, assessing eyes, and he was in the middle of berating a young teamster when Margaret planted herself in front of him and waited for him to stop talking. He looked at her when he finished. "You need something. Passage," she said. "I have a quilt." He laughed. It was not a cruel laugh exactly, but it was the laugh of a man who had heard everything. "Lady, a quilt doesn't get you to Oregon." "It is a fine quilt," Margaret said, and she unfolded the corner of it so he could see the quality of the stitching, the careful geometry of the pattern she had spent 2 winters completing. "Mother taught me to quilt, and her mother taught her. You will not find another like it between here and the Pacific." Hector Malone looked at the quilt with a practiced eye. He reached out and rubbed the fabric between his fingers. She could see him calculating something, not sentiment but practicality. A quilt like that was worth something in the right market. His wife, perhaps, a trade along the way. "I'll take it," he said finally, "but a quilt gets you to the end of my line, not to Oregon. My line ends at Fort Laramie. After that, you find your own way." It was not what she had hoped for. Fort Laramie was in Wyoming territory, still hundreds of miles from Ruth's farm in Oregon. But it was west, and it was further than she was now, and it was a start. "Agreed," she said, and she handed him the quilt before she could change her mind. She did not let herself look at it as he folded it under his arm. She kept her eyes forward, on the wagon she would be sharing with a family named Whitmore, a husband and wife and 3 small children who looked at her with the undisguised curiosity of people who had nothing to do but observe each other for the next several weeks. The train left Independence on a Tuesday in the middle of April, when the prairie grass was just beginning to suggest green through the brown. There were 17 wagons by the final count, with an assortment of families and single men and 1 other single woman, a widow named Edna Fitch who was going to join her son in Colorado and who chewed tobacco and told stories that made the Whitmore children cover their ears. Margaret walked beside the wagon more than she rode, because the Whitmore wagon was loaded to capacity, and there was barely room for her carpet bag, let alone her body. She walked in her good boots, the ones she had kept through everything, and she watched the land change around her as the days accumulated, the gentle roll of Missouri giving way to the flatter, browner, wider Kansas prairie, the sky becoming enormous and indifferent in a way that she found either terrifying or liberating, depending on how the day was going. She helped Mrs. Whitmore, whose name was Clara, a tired woman of 28 who was already expecting her 4th child, cook the evening meals and tend to the children. She helped with the washing, the mending, the endless small tasks that kept a traveling family from unraveling. She earned her place among them not through the quilt, which Hector Malone had taken as her passage fee, but through the simple currency of usefulness. At night, wrapped in her single wool blanket because the quilt was gone, she lay under the wagon and looked at the stars, which were different here than they had been in Ohio, more numerous, more emphatic, as though the prairie held nothing back from the sky. She thought about Thomas sometimes, but less than she expected. She thought about Ruth more, about the letter, about the word room, about what it would mean to stand on land that was not yet marked by loss. They crossed into Nebraska territory after 3 weeks of steady travel. The land was flat and the wind was constant, and the grass moved like water in all directions. The Platte River appeared to the north and they followed it, the way 1,000 wagon trains had followed it before them, along the old emigrant trail that had been worn into the earth so deeply it looked like a river of its own. It was on the Platte that Margaret first heard about Calvin Dunlap. One of the other travelers, a man named Grover Sykes who drove a mule team and talked too much, mentioned him over a campfire on an evening when the wind had dropped enough to make conversation pleasant. Calvin Dunlap, Grover said, was the man at Fort Laramie who handled the transition of travelers, the sorting and the planning and the organizing of groups heading further west from the fort. He had been doing it for 4 years. Before that, he had driven cattle up from Texas. Before that, he had served in the Union Army. He was, Grover said with a kind of reverential respect that seemed only partly exaggerated, the most capable man west of the Missouri and east of the Sierra Nevada. "Is he a kind man?" Clara Whitmore asked, because Clara asked questions like that, practical questions about the character of the world. Grover thought about it. "I never heard him described as unkind," he said. "He's straight is what he is, says what he means." Margaret listened and did not say anything, but she filed the name away in the organized ledger of her mind. Calvin Dunlap, Fort Laramie, the end of the line, the beginning of whatever came next. The weeks accumulated. They crossed the South Platte at a ford that nearly overturned 2 wagons, everyone wading in the cold water, the oxen complaining, the children screaming. Margaret held one of the Whitmore children on her hip through the crossing, a small boy named Percy who had decided she was his particular friend, and who attached himself to her side with the fervent devotion only available to 3-year-olds. She held Percy and crossed the river and did not think about the fact that she had absolutely nothing to bargain with if Fort Laramie was as far as her arrangement took her. She had thought about it enough in Ohio. She had thought about it on the train to Missouri. Somewhere on the Kansas prairie, the thinking had become less productive than the walking, and she had decided to simply walk until she arrived somewhere and then figure out from there. Fort Laramie rose up on a late May afternoon with the particular drama of a thing that has been anticipated for weeks. Margaret saw the adobe walls from a distance, the American flag above them snapping in the Wyoming wind, and felt something loosen in her chest, not relief, exactly, but a release of the effort of not looking at the distance between where she was and where she needed to be. The wagon train pulled into the fort's outer compound in the late afternoon, and there was the usual scramble of arrival livestock to secure, supplies to check, letters from civilization to search for among the fort's limited mail. Hector Malone went immediately to find the fort commander. The Whitmore children ran in circles. Edna Fitch spat tobacco into the dust and declared the West overdone. And at the edge of the compound, near a low building with a sign that read outfitters and passage arrangements in plain black letters, a man stood with his arms crossed and watched the arrival with the patient attention of someone who had seen many arrivals and found each one equally interesting and equally demanding of his attention. Margaret noticed him the way you noticed a particular tree in a landscape, not immediately, but inevitably, because he was the point around which everything else seemed to organize. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked outdoors, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that was clean-shaven in a country where most men wore significant beards. He wore a dark coat over a plain shirt, and his boots were worn and practical, and there was nothing decorative about him except for the quality of his stillness. The way he stood without fidgeting, without needing to fill the space around him with movement. He was, she would later learn, 36 years old. His eyes found hers across the compound, and he held her gaze for a moment in the direct and uncalculating way of a man who has no particular agenda but is paying attention. Then he looked away, back at the wagons, because there was work to be done and he was a practical man. Margaret looked away too. She had work to be done as well. The fort was a place of genuine busyness, a way station between the settled East and the wide unknown West, and it had accumulated around itself a small civilian community. A blacksmith, a dry goods store, a woman who sold pies from a window in the afternoon, a doctor who served both the military garrison and the traveling public. Margaret spent the first evening helping the Whitmore family settle their camp, feeding the children, listening to Percy's detailed account of everything he had seen during the day, which was extensive. The next morning she went to the low building with the plain sign. Calvin Dunlap was behind a wide wooden table covered with maps and papers, talking to a man in a cavalry uniform about something that involved a great deal of pointing at a particular section of a map. Margaret waited. She was accustomed to waiting. She sat on a wooden bench near the door and watched the activity of the fort through the open window: soldiers drilling, a blacksmith hammering, a dog trotting by with tremendous purpose, until the cavalryman left and the man behind the table looked up. "Help you?" he said. His voice was lower than she had expected, even and without particular warmth or coolness, simply present. "I need passage to Oregon," Margaret said. "I have nothing to barter." He looked at her for a moment, not with pity and not with dismissal, and not with the particular evaluation she had grown accustomed to from men who were deciding whether a woman was worth their time. He looked at her the way a person looks at a situation, with assessment and without judgment. "Nothing at all," he said. "I had a quilt," she said. "I bartered it for passage from Independence to here. I have 37 cents and a carpet bag and a letter from my sister in Oregon who is expecting me." He was quiet for a moment. He looked back at his maps, then at her again. "What kind of work can you do?" She blinked. It was not the question she had expected. "Any kind," she said. "I can cook, sew, dress wounds, help with livestock if needed, read and write and do basic accounts, and I have been told I am persistent to a fault." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was related to one. "We have a family, the Hendersons, heading out in 4 days with a group of 8 wagons going northwest," he said. "Mrs. Henderson is unwell, has been since Kearney. They need someone to help manage the household, traveling, cooking, children, the practical work. They can't pay much, but they can give you passage to wherever they're going, which is the Willamette Valley." The Willamette Valley. That was where Ruth was. Margaret's heart did a thing that surprised her, a quick, hard knock of possibility. "I'll do it," she said immediately. "I'll introduce you this afternoon," he said. "My name is Calvin Dunlap." "Margaret Keller," she said. He nodded once and she stood to leave, and then he said, without looking up from his papers, "You won't need to barter again, Mrs. Keller. The rest of your way is accounted for." She stopped with her hand on the door frame and looked back at him. He was already reading something. His attention returned to the work in front of him, and she stood there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, studying the angle of his jaw and the particular way his hands moved across the maps deliberately, with the confidence of someone who knew the land they were describing, before she stepped out into the Wyoming morning. She told herself it was simply gratitude. It was the relief of a practical problem being solved. It had nothing to do with the sound of his voice, or the fact that for the first time in many months she had felt, in someone's company, that she was being seen clearly and that the view was not unwelcome. The Hendersons were a family of 6, a man named Robert who was large and gentle and worried about his wife with a visible, aching constancy, a wife named Sarah who was pale and thin and had a cough that sounded like a door on a bad hinge, and 4 children ranging in age from 5 to 12. Sarah Henderson looked at Margaret with the desperate gratitude of a woman who had been too ill to ask for help and had not known how to accept it when it came. "Can you manage them?" Sarah asked, nodding at the children, who were watching Margaret with the combined suspicion and hope of a jury still deliberating. "I raised 2 younger brothers," Margaret said, which was not entirely true but was close enough to be useful. "I can manage." The 4 days before departure were busy in the way that Fort Laramie days were always busy. Margaret organized the Henderson wagon, learning where everything was stored and how Sarah liked things done the particular way she packed the food supply, the order in which the children's bedding was arranged, the small rituals of domesticity that were even more important when your home was a moving box on wheels. She was good at this. She had always been good at this, at reading the structure beneath the surface of other people's lives and slipping into it without disrupting what was there. She saw Calvin Dunlap several times during those 4 days. He was everywhere in the way that a person responsible for everything is everywhere: at the wagons in the morning, at the trading post in the afternoon, at the campfires in the evening, moving through the fort's world with the unhurried efficiency of a man who never did one thing when he could do 3. He stopped to check on the Henderson wagon one morning, and he and Robert Henderson talked about the route with the seriousness of men who understood that the difference between a good route and a bad one was sometimes measured in lives. Margaret was sorting through the food stores in the wagon and could hear them through the canvas. She was not listening on purpose, but the fort was a small place and the canvas was thin. "What do you think of the woman?" Robert Henderson asked. "She capable?" "Yes," Calvin said without hesitation. There was a brief pause. "She's steadier than most of the people I send west. She'll do well." Margaret said nothing. She kept sorting beans into a cloth sack and did not smile at the canvas wall of the wagon. That evening, the last evening before departure, there was a small gathering at the campfire between the Henderson wagon and the one belonging to a family named Alcott. Someone had a fiddle. The Wyoming night was cold and clear, and the stars were the same extravagant stars she had been watching since Kansas, and there was coffee and a little whiskey for those who wanted it. Calvin Dunlap came, which surprised her, because she had assumed he would be at his papers or his maps. He sat at the edge of the firelight with a cup of coffee, and he talked to Robert Henderson for a while about the trail conditions north of the fort. And then the conversation broadened to include everyone. And then the fiddle started, and someone's daughter danced, and Percy Whitmore, who had somehow attached himself to the Henderson camp for the evening, fell asleep against Margaret's side with the absolute trust of the very young and the very tired. Margaret sat with the sleeping child against her and watched the fire, and then she became aware that Calvin was watching her, not staring, not intrusively, but with the quiet attention she had noticed in him before. She looked up and found his eyes, and this time neither of them looked away immediately. "You must have seen 100 trains come through here," she said. "More than 100, he said. "Do you never go further west yourself?" Something moved across his face. Not pain exactly, but the shadow of something considered and then set aside. "Not any more," he said. "There was a time, but this is where I'm useful. Is being useful enough?" She asked, and she was not sure why she asked it. It was too direct for a first real conversation, too close to something she herself was wrestling with, and she expected him to retreat behind the practical. Instead, he looked at her with a kind of frank thoughtfulness. "It has been," he said. "I'm not certain it is any more." Percy stirred against her side, and she looked down to settle the child, and when she looked up, Calvin was talking to someone else, and the moment had closed as naturally as it had opened. She lay under the Henderson wagon that night in her wool blanket and thought about the word anymore, and what it might mean, and whether it was any of her business, and concluded firmly that it was not, and that she should sleep because they departed at dawn. She did not sleep for quite some time. The wagon train heading northwest from Fort Laramie was composed of 8 wagons and 23 people, led by a seasoned guide named Pete Ogden, who had made the Oregon crossing 6 times, and who communicated almost exclusively in short declarative sentences. Margaret found Pete Ogden entirely comprehensible. He told them where to stop, and when to go, and what to watch for, and these were exactly the kinds of statements Margaret appreciated. The land northwest of Fort Laramie was different from the Kansas prairie, harder, more dramatic, with the Laramie Mountains rising to the west, and the trail winding through country that felt ancient and indifferent to human passage. The days were long and the work was constant, and Margaret found her rhythm within the first week, rising before dawn to start the fire and have coffee ready when the Henderson children woke, managing the day's travel with the same systematic attention she had given to everything else. Sarah Henderson improved somewhat with the spring air and the forward motion, as though her body had needed direction as much as medicine. She was still not well, but she was better, and she sat with Margaret in the evenings and talked about Oregon, about what Robert had told her, about the letters from friends who had already settled there, about the particular quality of the Willamette Valley light in the autumn. "You have a sister there," Sarah said one evening. "Ruth," Margaret said. "She married well, a good farmer. She wants me to come." "You will be glad of it," Sarah said. "Having family," Margaret nodded. She thought about what being glad felt like. She thought she was beginning to remember. She also, in the privacy of her own thoughts and the long walking hours of the trail, thought about Calvin Dunlap with a regularity that she found both inconvenient and impossible to stop. She thought about the sound of his voice and the steadiness of him, the way he had solved her problem without making her feel small for having it. She thought about any more. She thought these were entirely useless thoughts and told herself so each morning, and then thought them again anyway. They had been on the trail for 11 days when a rider caught up with their train from the direction of Fort Laramie. It was late afternoon, and they had stopped to water the livestock at a creek that ran clear and cold out of the hills to the west. Margaret was refilling the water barrels, work that was unglamorous but essential, when she heard the horse before she saw it, coming fast from the southeast, the kind of speed that made people look up and step back from the trail. The rider pulled up beside the lead wagon. He was a young soldier from the fort, breathing hard, with a dispatch bag over his shoulder. He spoke to Pete Ogden, and she could see Pete's face change, a slight tightening, a quick consideration, and then Pete looked down the line of wagons with the scanning gaze of a man searching for something specific. His eyes found her. "Mrs. Keller," Pete called out, and his voice carried the peculiar neutrality of a man delivering news he has not been authorized to interpret. She walked toward him with the water bucket still in her hand, because when someone called your name you came. "There's a message," Pete said, and he took a folded paper from the soldier. "From Mr. Dunlap at the fort." She took the paper. It was folded and sealed with plain wax, and her name was written on the outside in plain dark ink. She opened it with her thumb. It said, "Mrs. Keller, I have just received word that I will be going north to survey a new route through the Black Hills for the Army, beginning next week. This is not the business I wanted to write to you about. I wanted to write to you about the fact that in 4 days you have been on the trail, I have found myself thinking about our conversation at the fire. I am not a man who writes letters easily or often. I thought you should know that in my experience, the things that are worth saying, even when the timing is impractical. I hope you reach Oregon safely. C. Dunlap." Margaret stood at the side of the trail in the Wyoming afternoon and read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of her dress, the one closest to her body. She went back to the water barrel. She finished filling it. She loaded it onto the wagon. That night, after the children were asleep, she borrowed paper and a pen from Mrs. Alcott, who had both because she was writing her memoirs, and she wrote a reply that she gave to Pete Ogden with the request that he send it back with the soldier in the morning, who was returning to the fort. She wrote, "Mr. Dunlap, I have found myself thinking about the same conversation, and about the word you used anymore, and what it implies about before and after. I'm a practical woman who has learned to value what is real over what is convenient, and what is real is that a man who solves a stranger's problem and then writes a letter to tell her she is worth thinking about is a man worth thinking about in return. I hope the survey goes well. The sky is very large out here. M. Keller." She was not certain the letter would reach him. She was not certain she was being wise. She was 31 years old and had been a widow for 14 months, and she was crossing Wyoming in a wagon heading for her sister's house in Oregon. And the most interesting thing that had happened to her in 14 months was a man at a fort who said she would not need to barter again, and then wrote her a letter 4 days later. She decided this was a fact worth acknowledging. The trail continued. The weeks continued. The Black Hills gave way to the Snake River Plain, and the Snake River Plain was brutal in the summer heat, dry and rocky, and punishing on the livestock and the wagon wheels, and the people who had to walk beside them. 2 of Pete Ogden's 8 wagons had wheel trouble on the same day, and they lost half a day to repairs, and the water situation became tighter as they moved through the driest stretches. Margaret worked. That was what she did. She worked because the Hendersons needed her, and because work was the antidote to most things, and because in the long hot days of the Snake River crossing, she did not have the luxury of thinking about anything except the next water, the next meal, the next step. But at night, in the short, cool darkness, she let herself think about the letter in her pocket and about whether a man surveying the Black Hills for the Army was thinking about her, and concluded that this was probably not useful to think about, but that she was going to think about it anyway. They crossed into Oregon territory in late July. The moment Pete Ogden announced it, standing beside his horse in the mid-morning light with the same flat, declarative brevity he used for everything, Margaret felt something in her chest that she had not felt in a long time, the specific relief of arrival. Not at a destination, but at something. At the edge of something. Oregon was green in a way that Wyoming had not been. The trees came back real trees, not just the scrub of the high plains, but Douglas fir and pine, and the air had moisture in it that her skin and her lungs received with something close to gratitude. The Willamette Valley, when they finally descended into it in the first week of August, was exactly what Sarah Henderson had described: light that came down through the trees at an angle that made everything look considered, like a painting someone had worked at carefully. Ruth Briggs was waiting at the crossroads where the Alcott family had agreed to deposit Margaret on their way to their own land claim further south. She was standing beside a farm wagon with a man who could only be Harold, and when she saw Margaret, she made a sound that Margaret would later describe to no one, because it was too private, a sound of relief and love, and the specific grief of people who have been separated and reunited, and who feel both things at once. They held each other for a long moment in the August morning. Margaret smelled Ruth's familiar soap and felt Ruth's arms around her, and thought that this was one kind of home, the kind made of people rather than places, and that she had traveled 2,000 miles to stand in it. Harold Briggs turned out to be a large, quiet, kind man who shook Margaret's hand with the gravity of someone who understood what handshakes meant. He loaded her carpet bag into his wagon without being asked, and on the drive to the farm he talked about the land, what he was growing, what the weather had been, what the neighbors were like, with the steady, informative cheerfulness of a man who loved his life and was not ashamed to say so. The farm was good. It was genuinely, straightforwardly good, a solid house, a well-tended garden, fields of wheat and oats that were headed toward a good harvest. Ruth showed her the room where she would sleep, a small room with a window that looked west, and the bed had a quilt on it, not Margaret's quilt, which was presumably warming Hector Malone's wife in Nebraska by now, but a quilt that Ruth had made in blue and yellow, and Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms into the fabric and felt herself, for the first time in a very long time, still. She stayed. She helped. She found her place in the rhythm of Ruth and Harold's farm with the same systematic grace she had brought to the Henderson wagon, and she was genuinely happy here, or something close to it, something that would be happy if she let it be, if she stopped noticing the particular shape of the absence she couldn't quite name. She wrote a second letter to Calvin Dunlap, care of Fort Laramie, and she was not entirely certain she expected a reply. She described Oregon, the light, the trees, the specific green of it, the way the mountains looked from Ruth's farm in the evenings. She described Ruth and Harold with affection. She wrote that she had arrived, that the sisters' letter had been worth following, and that she thought about their conversation at the campfire with a frequency that probably said something about her. She sent the letter with Harold on his next trip into town, with very little expectation, because the Army survey might have taken Calvin Dunlap anywhere, and a letter from a woman he had spoken to twice and written to once was not necessarily something a man waited for. He wrote back in 3 weeks. The letter came on a Wednesday, and Ruth handed it to her at breakfast with a studied casualness that did not quite conceal the curiosity in her eyes. Margaret took the letter and put it in her pocket and waited until she was alone in the garden, which took longer than she would have liked, because Ruth found reasons to be in the garden with some frequency that morning. When she finally had privacy, she sat on the garden fence and read. He wrote that the survey was finished and had been successful, and that he was back at Fort Laramie. He wrote that her letter had been given to him by a corporal who had held it for 3 weeks during his absence, and that he had read it the same evening it was delivered. He wrote that he had thought about her description of the Oregon light, and had looked at the Wyoming sky that night with more attention than he usually gave it. He wrote that he had a month before the next wagon season, and that he was considering what to do with it. He wrote, at the end, "I am not a man who has given much consideration to the future lately. I have been focused on the present, which is my work in this fort and the practical matter of helping people go somewhere else while I remain here." You used the word home, and I found myself considering whether I have one or only a place I operate from. I believe there is a difference. I'm not certain how to resolve it, but I find that writing to you makes the question feel more possible to think about. C.D. Margaret sat on the garden fence and looked at the Oregon mountains, and thought that she was in serious and genuine trouble, and that it was the most alive she had felt since Thomas died. She wrote back immediately. She wrote about home and what she thought it meant, not a place, but a way of being in a place, a quality of belonging that came from choosing to stay rather than needing to. She wrote that she had found it, partially, here with Ruth and Harold, but that there was a part of it still missing, and she was beginning to understand what shape that part was. She did not say, "The shape is you," But she thought it, and she thought he might understand it anyway because he seemed to be a man who read carefully. September came and went. The harvest was good. She helped Ruth put up vegetables for the winter and helped Harold with the accounts, which she was better at than he was. And she sat at the kitchen table in the evenings with the lamp lit and wrote letters to a man in Wyoming and received his letters in return. And the letters grew longer and more specific and more honest in the way that letters between two serious people always do. He told her about his family, a father who had been a preacher in Virginia, a mother who had died when he was 12, 2 brothers who had scattered after the war. He told her about the cattle driving, about the years of moving from place to place before Fort Laramie settled him. He told her that he had been married once briefly, to a woman who had not been able to manage the West and who had gone back east, and whom he had allowed to go because he had known, even then, that asking her to stay would not have been loving her well. He had been 30 when she left. He had been at Fort Laramie for 4 years since. "He sounds like a good man," Ruth said one evening, having extracted the general outline of the correspondence from Margaret through the patient application of sisterly persistence. "He is," Margaret said. "What are you going to do about it?" Margaret looked at her knitting. "He is 2,000 miles away. People cross 2,000 miles, Ruth said. "You did. I crossed it to come here. Maybe he'll cross it in the other direction." Margaret said nothing, but she thought about it. She thought about it quite a lot. The letter that changed things came in October, when the Oregon rains had started and the mountains were gray with cloud. It was longer than his previous letters, 4 pages of neat, close writing, and it was honest in a way that made her hands shake a little. He wrote that he had been offered a position at Fort Vancouver, much closer to Oregon, and that he was considering it. He wrote that he did not want to be dishonest about what was making him consider it. He wrote that he understood their correspondence had been conducted over distance, and that what seemed clear on paper sometimes dissolved when confronted with reality, and that he was not a man who made declarations lightly, but that he was also not a young man, and had lived enough of his life to understand the difference between caution and foolishness. He wrote that he would like very much to meet her in person, if she was open to it, in a setting where they could speak plainly and determine whether the thing that seemed to be happening between them on paper was real. He wrote at the end, "I am a practical man, Mrs. Keller. But I find that I am also, apparently, a man who drove cattle up from Texas and ran wagon trains across the continent and helped hundreds of people go somewhere they wanted to go, and who has been standing at the end of the line long enough that he would like, very much, to be going somewhere himself. I am wondering if you might tell me whether there is room." Calvin. He had used his first name. He had used her first name at no point in the letter, and yet the use of his own felt like an invitation to use it in return. Margaret sat at Ruth's kitchen table and read the letter twice and then a third time. Then she folded it and sat quietly for a moment. Ruth was in the other room. The rain was very loud on the roof, which was a sound she had come to love in Oregon, the specific industriousness of rain on cedar shingles. She went to the desk. She took out paper. She wrote, "Calvin, there is room." She sent it the next morning, and then she waited in the Oregon rain with the particular patience of a woman who has crossed a continent and is therefore not undone by a few weeks. He came in November. He did not send advance notice, because that was not how Calvin Dunlap operated, or at least that was what she understood later, that he had made the decision and acted on it and trusted the decision to be sound. He appeared on a Tuesday morning at the gate of Harold Briggs's farm, on a dark horse with 2 saddlebags, wearing his dark coat and his practical boots and his not quite a smile. And Harold came in from the barn to find him at the gate and went to fetch Margaret without asking questions, because Harold Briggs was a perceptive man. Margaret was in the kitchen. She put down the bread she was kneading and wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the front door. And there, he was real and present in a way that letters, however honest, could never quite accomplish. He was taller than she had remembered. He was older-looking in the morning light, with weathering around his eyes and a seriousness in his face that was different from the lamplight of the Fort Laramie campfire. But his eyes were the same, that direct, assessing, unjudging look that had noticed her across the compound and seen something worth writing 4 pages about. "You came," she said. "I said I was considering it," he said. "You didn't say you decided." "I didn't want to be presumptuous." They looked at each other across the muddy yard for a moment. The Oregon rain had paused, as it sometimes did, in the interest of giving the world a moment to breathe. "You'd better come in," she said. "I'm making bread." He tied his horse at the post and came in. Ruth appeared from the back of the house with the speed of a woman who had been listening, which she had been, and she introduced herself with a warmth that was genuine and a curiosity that was undisguised. Harold came in from the barn and shook Calvin's hand with the gravity he gave to all handshakes. They sat around the kitchen table and ate bread with butter and drank coffee and talked about the trail, about the survey, about the conditions at Fort Laramie, about the journey west. And the conversation was easy in the way that real things are easy, without the strain of performance. After a while, Ruth managed to extract Harold from the kitchen with an excuse about the barn that was transparent but effective, and Margaret and Calvin were left at the table with their coffee cups and the sound of the rain beginning again on the roof. "I read your letters very carefully," he said. "I read yours the same way," she said. "I know that what I have to offer is—" He stopped. He started again. "I have been at Fort Laramie for 4 years. Before that I moved constantly. I am good at the work I do, and I can build something good if I have a reason to build it in a specific place. I am not certain I have the words for what I want to say, so I will say it plainly." "Plain suits me," she said. "I would like to know you," he said. "In person, here. I would like to spend time with you and let us determine honestly whether what the letters suggest is real. I'm not asking for anything certain yet. I'm asking for the chance to be present long enough to find out." Margaret looked at him, at his careful, honest face, at the way he held his coffee cup with both hands, at the specific quality of his attention, which had always made her feel seen rather than observed. "I would like that too," she said. He stayed. Not in the Briggs house, that would not have been appropriate, and he was a man who understood appropriateness, but at the boarding house in the nearby town of Amity, a small Oregon settlement of several hundred people that had a school and a general store and a Methodist church, and the particular civic self-seriousness of a town that was new enough to still be deciding what it was. He came to the farm every day. He helped Harold with the autumn work, the fencing that needed mending, the firewood that needed cutting, the barn repairs that Harold had been putting off since summer. And he did these things without being asked and without making a production of them, because he was a man who saw what needed doing and did it. In the evenings he sat with Margaret in the kitchen or the parlor and they talked about everything, about Ohio and Virginia, about Thomas and about the woman who had gone back east, about the war and its particular damage, about the country they had both crossed in different ways and for different reasons. He was different from Thomas. Thomas had been warm and immediate and funny, a man who filled a room with sound. Calvin was quieter, more considered, a man who filled a room with presence. You knew he was there without him making any particular effort to announce it. Margaret found that she was not comparing them so much as simply seeing Calvin clearly as his own thing, a specific man with specific qualities, and the qualities were not deficient. She found that she liked him. This seemed important. Admiration and attraction were one kind of thing, but she liked him, liked his company, liked his way of thinking, liked the rhythm of his sentences and the way he listened. She had not expected that the liking would precede and accompany everything else and make it better for being there. November became December. The Oregon winter settled in with purpose. Calvin remained. It was during a particularly wet December afternoon, when the rain had driven them both inside and they were sitting at the parlor table working on separate tasks. She was mending a shirt of Harold's. He was reviewing some maps connected to the Fort Vancouver position he had not yet officially accepted, that he looked up and said without preamble, I have been thinking about the quilt. She looked up. What about it? You bartered your last quilt to get to Fort Laramie, he said. I have thought about that, about what that means to give away the last of something, particularly something made from what you had before. I have thought about it too, she said carefully. I want you to have a quilt, he said. Not that one is gone, but I want you to have one that is yours. I want you to never be in a position of bartering the last of something again. He paused. I want to be the reason for that, if you'll have me. Margaret set down Harold's shirt. The rain was very loud. She thought about the morning in Independence when she had handed over the quilt and not let herself look at it. She thought about everything that had happened since, the river crossing, the plains, the Wyoming sky, the campfire, the letter in her pocket, the 2,000 miles. She thought about the man across the table from her who had come 2,000 miles himself on the other side and who had found her here at the specific crossroads where they had both been heading without knowing it. Calvin, she said. He was looking at her directly with that clear and unhurried attention. Yes, she said. I'll have you. He exhaled a short, controlled sound that was the most unguarded thing she had heard from him. The sound of a man who had been holding something carefully and could now set it down. He crossed the parlor in 3 steps. He took her hand, both her hands actually, holding them in his in a grip that was gentle and entirely certain, and looked at her the way he had looked at maps, which was to say with the concentration of a man who was memorizing terrain that mattered. I should do this properly, he said. You should not speak to Harold before you've spoken to me, she said, and she was smiling now, which surprised her, but it was a real smile, the kind that came from somewhere deep and had been waiting for permission. I am a grown woman who has crossed the country on my own, and I will be making my own decisions. That is fair, he said. He was smiling too, which transformed his face entirely, made it younger and warmer and more entirely itself. Will you marry me, Margaret? Yes, she said. I will marry you, Calvin. He leaned forward and kissed her gently once in the decent and earnest way of a man who means it and wants to be understood to mean it, and she kissed him back with the warm steadiness of a woman who has been waiting for something real and is glad to have finally found it. Ruth walked in from the kitchen approximately 30 seconds later with the perfect timing of a woman who had been listening at the door, and her face was the face of someone who had hoped for exactly this and was gratified to be right. Well, she said. Well, Margaret said, and she was still smiling. They were married in the Amity Methodist Church on a Saturday in January of 1873, in a ceremony that was small and plain and entirely real. Ruth stood up with Margaret and Harold stood up with Calvin, which felt appropriate, the 4 of them at the center of it, these 2 families made from different roads that had converged here in the Oregon winter. Margaret wore her good dress, the dark blue one, which she had preserved through everything. Calvin wore his dark coat, which he had cleaned and pressed at the boarding house, and he stood at the front of the church with the stillness that was characteristic of him, which now she understood as not coldness, but depth, the stillness of a man who had enough inside him that he did not need to put it all on the surface. When she walked down the narrow aisle of the Amity Church on Harold Briggs's arm, Calvin watched her come toward him with the expression of a man encountering something he had not been certain he deserved and was grateful for anyway. She walked steadily, the way she walked across everything, and when she stood beside him and looked at his face, she thought, yes. This is the thing that was missing. This is the shape of it. The preacher spoke. They said the words. Calvin's voice was even and clear and entirely certain. Hers was steady, which she was proud of because she had been afraid she might cry. She did not cry. She felt too fully and completely present for tears. He put a plain gold band on her finger that he had bought at the jeweler's in town, and it was warm from being in his pocket, and she held his hand after the ring was placed and felt the warmth of the metal and the warmth of his hand around hers, and thought that this was exactly the right temperature for a January in Oregon. After the ceremony, there was a small dinner at Ruth's house, just the 4 of them and 2 neighboring families who had become friendly over the autumn, and someone brought a cake, and Harold opened a bottle of something he had been saving, and there was warmth and light, and the specific happiness of people gathered around a table celebrating something true. Calvin and Margaret sat beside each other through the dinner, and several times she felt his hand find hers under the table, not elaborately, just the simple reassurance of contact, the human instinct to verify that the good thing is still there. Each time she turned her hand and held his back. They had taken a small house in Amity. Calvin had arranged it before the wedding, because he was a man who arranged things, who saw the practical shape of the future and prepared for it. It was a modest house, 2 rooms downstairs and a loft, with a garden that would be good in spring and a view of the mountains on clear days. It was on the eastern edge of town, which meant that on clear mornings you could see the sun come up over the mountains in a way that Margaret found, when she first saw it, almost unbearably beautiful. Calvin had taken the Fort Vancouver position officially in December, which involved periodic travel to the fort 3 or 4 times a year, but primarily meant he was coordinating wagon passages from the Oregon end, receiving the trains that made it through, and organizing the allocation of land claims and resources, a job that suited his particular combination of organizational skill and human steadiness. He was good at it. He had always been good at this kind of work, the work of helping people arrive. Margaret found her own work easily. Amity was small enough to need everything and knew enough to value people who could do things. She kept accounts for the general store because the proprietor, a man named Holt, was hopeless at numbers and knew it. She taught a small reading class on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons for children whose parents had not had schooling themselves, in the back room of the church, because there was no school yet in Amity and someone needed to do it. She kept the house with the same systematic attention she had brought to everything, and the garden in spring became a genuine garden, vegetables and herbs, and in the corner by the fence flowers, because she decided she was allowed flowers. The quilt was made that spring. Margaret made it herself, cutting fabric from what she had pieces of her good blue dress that was too worn now for good occasions, a shirt of Calvin's that had developed an unfixable tear, fabric Ruth brought over in a basket one afternoon without explanation. It was not as fine as the quilt she had bartered in Independence. It was made from different things, from what this life had rather than what the previous one had, and it was therefore, she decided, exactly right. She finished it on an evening in April, and she spread it on the bed in the room where she and Calvin slept, and she stood back and looked at it in the lamplight. Calvin came in from the other room and stood beside her, and they looked at it together. "It's good," he said. "It is," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned against his side, and they stood there in the lamplight looking at the quilt made from their lives, and it was a good moment. One of the kind that you recognize as it is happening rather than only in retrospect, one of the moments that makes up the actual substance of a life. The spring of 1873 was kind to Oregon and to the town of Amity and to the small house on the eastern edge of it. The garden came up with extraordinary enthusiasm, as though the ground had been waiting for Margaret specifically. Calvin came home from his work at reasonable hours and they ate supper together and talked about the town and the people and the letters that arrived from the east, from Ohio, where Thomas's sister wrote occasionally, from Calvin's brothers who were scattered but alive, from Ruth who lived 20 minutes away but wrote letters anyway because she was a letter-writing woman. Margaret wrote to the Hendersons, who had settled 30 miles north in the valley, and from whom she had received a cheerful note reporting that Sarah's health had improved substantially, and the children were well, and Robert had built a fine barn. She wrote to Clara Whitmore, who had made it to California and had delivered her 4th child, a girl, safely. She wrote to Edna Fitch in Colorado, who wrote back in brief, tobacco-scented sentences that were nonetheless warm. She wrote to nobody about the fact that by June she was fairly certain she was expecting a child. She waited until she was entirely certain, and then she told Calvin on an evening when the June light was long and gold, and the mountains were very clear. He was sitting on the front step of the house when she told him, and he went very still in the way that she had learned, meant he was feeling something important that was still finding its form. Then he stood up and turned to her, and what was on his face was an open, undefended happiness that she had not seen from him before, not the restrained smile or the private warmth, but the full, unguarded thing, the happiness of a man who has been careful with himself for a long time and is finally willing to let something be simply good. He held her for a long moment very carefully, as though she might be fragile, and she laughed against his shoulder because she was not fragile. She had crossed the continent in a wagon and bartered her last quilt for passage, and arrived alone at a strange fort, and she was not fragile in the least, and he laughed too, the laugh of a man who was allowed to be happy and knew it. Ruth cried when Margaret told her, which was the sort of thing Ruth did beautifully and without self-consciousness. Harold shook Calvin's hand with particular gravity and then clapped him on the shoulder, and the gesture said something that Harold did not put into words but did not need to. The summer was good. The work at the general store was light enough that Margaret continued it through August, and the reading class continued through July, and the garden produced more tomatoes than any two people could reasonably eat, which they distributed to neighbors with a generosity that made them popular. Calvin was home more than he was away, and when he was away she did not worry about him in the hovering way she had sometimes worried about Thomas, because Calvin was a man you trusted to manage whatever was in front of him, and this was a quality in him that she valued more than she could easily say. He built a second room onto the back of the house in August, a proper bedroom for what was coming, with a window that faced east, and he built it himself, with Harold's help on the weekend, and Margaret watched from the garden and thought about how different this was from every other version of her life, and how very right it felt to be exactly here. Their son was born in February of 1874, in the house on the eastern edge of Amity, with Ruth present and Calvin present, and a doctor named Evans who was reliable and calm, which was all she asked of doctors. He was born at 3 in the morning, in the way that children sometimes chose the dramatic hour, and when he arrived he was loud about it, which Calvin said was a good sign, and which Margaret agreed was probably an excellent sign. They named him Thomas Calvin Dunlap, Thomas for the man who had been her husband and was gone, because love does not disappear when a person does, and honoring it honestly is the right thing. Calvin for the man beside her now, whose hand she had held through the long hours and who had not once been anything but steady. She liked the name. It held both things, the before and the after, and she thought that was honest, and honesty had always mattered to her. Calvin held Thomas Calvin Dunlap for the first time while the February dawn was beginning outside the east window of the new room, and he held him with the same careful confidence he brought to everything, and looked at him with a complete and undisguised wonder that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. He looked up at her after a moment, and she was tired in the deep and complete way of a woman who has just done an enormous amount of work, and he looked at her with that expression and said, "He looks like he knows something." "He looks like he wants breakfast," she said. "Practical," Calvin said. "He gets that from you." The life they built was not dramatic in the way of stories that people tell. It was good in the way that real things are good consistently and quietly, and with the specific texture of a life that has been chosen deliberately. Calvin's work expanded as the Oregon Territory grew, which it did steadily through the 1870s, and he became a known man in the region, known for his fairness and his competence, and his particular quality of being present without being imposing. Margaret's accounting work grew beyond the general store into the broader town, and she became the person Amity consulted when numbers mattered, which was a frequent necessity in a growing settlement. They moved out of the small house when Thomas was 18 months old, not far, just to a larger house on the western side of town, with a proper kitchen and 4 rooms and a barn where Calvin eventually kept 2 horses and a pair of draft animals. Margaret moved the quilt to the new bedroom, and it looked right there, on the wide bed in the room that was properly and permanently theirs. Amity grew. The school that Margaret had been providing informally became an official school, and she helped establish it with the same systematic attention she gave to everything, persuading the town council that a permanent teacher was essential and that the building needed to be sound. She taught there for the first year while they searched for a permanent teacher, and she was good at it, though she preferred the accounts. Ruth and Harold had children of their own, 2 boys and then a girl, and the extended family gathered on Sundays and at holidays with the comfortable noise of people who have found each other and intend to stay. In the spring of 1876, Margaret found herself expecting again. This time she told Calvin immediately, in the kitchen at breakfast, and he received the news with the same open happiness he had shown the first time, tempered now with the experience of having done this once before, the practical joy of someone who knows exactly what is coming and wants it anyway. This time was a girl. They named her Clara Ruth Dunlap, Clara for Clara Whitmore, who had been kind to a stranger walking beside a wagon in Kansas, and Ruth for the sister who had written the letter that started all of this, who cried again when she heard the name and was not at all embarrassed about it. Clara was different from Thomas. Where Thomas had been immediately loud and demanding, Clara arrived quietly and looked around with large dark eyes as though she was assessing the situation before committing to an opinion. Calvin said this one got her nature from him. Margaret said it got it from her, and that the dark eyes were certainly hers. This debate continued pleasantly for several years and was never resolved, because neither of them really wanted to resolve it. Thomas was 2.5 when Clara was born, and he regarded his sister with the suspicious fascination of a child who has been the center of everything and is now negotiating a new arrangement. Within a week he had decided she was acceptable. Within a month he had appointed himself her particular protector, which was touching and occasionally excessive, but was, Margaret thought, a quality she would not discourage. The years moved with the particular speed of a life that is full. There was work, always, the accounts, the school board, the house, the garden, the 2 children who grew with astonishing rapidity from babies to small people with opinions and preferences, and the specific genius for finding trouble that is the natural occupation of the young. Calvin was present for all of it, in the way that mattered not every moment, because he was a working man with a real job, but present in the way that counted, at the table in the evenings and on the Sundays, and in the particular moments when presence was what was needed. He was a good father. She had not known this about him before, because there was no way to know it before, but she found it unsurprising once she saw it, the same qualities that made him good at his work, the steadiness and the patience and the genuine attention, translated perfectly into the specific work of raising children. He built Thomas a small carved horse for his 3rd birthday. He carried Clara through the house on his shoulders when she was fretful and would not settle for anyone else. He sat at the kitchen table on winter evenings and helped Thomas with his letters when Margaret was occupied with something else, and he did it with the same even temperament he brought to maps and logistics and everything else. One evening in the autumn of 1877, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet with the particular quiet of a house where people are sleeping, Margaret and Calvin sat on the front step in the cool October air and looked at the mountains. The stars were out. Oregon stars were different from Wyoming stars, softer, less emphatic, but they were plentiful and bright. "I think about Fort Laramie sometimes," she said. "Do you?" He had his arm around her and she was warm against his side. "I think about standing at that table and telling you I had nothing to barter," she said. "And you didn't look at me like I was a problem. You looked at me like I was a situation that had a solution." "You were," he said. "You are." "I think about you writing that letter," she said, "when I was 11 days up the trail, the soldier bringing it, Pete Ogden handing it to me at the creek. "I thought about it for 4 days before I wrote it," he said. "I nearly didn't." She looked up at him. "Why didn't you?" "Because I wrote it," he said, which was the kind of answer that would have frustrated her from someone else, but from Calvin she understood entirely that the writing was the answer to the hesitation, that he had decided to trust the thing that seemed worth doing and had done it. "I am glad you did," she said. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "So am I." They sat in the October night and listened to the quiet and were comfortable in it, which was, Margaret thought, perhaps the most accurate measure of the real thing. Not the wildness of the first feeling or the drama of the letters or the long crossing of the continent, but this. Two people sitting in the dark together, comfortable in the quiet, not needing to fill it with anything. The quilt lasted for years. Margaret mended it as it needed mending, patching the places where the fabric wore thin with new fabric that came from new things. A dress that had seen better days, a shirt that Calvin had worn out, a piece of flannel from a baby blanket that Thomas had loved to destruction. It became over time a record of the life rather than just its beginning, a map of every year stitched into the fabric, and she kept it on the bed through every season and thought sometimes, smoothing her hand across it in the mornings, about the quilt she had given away in Independence, the wedding dress and the flannel shirts, the ivory and the blue, and she was not sad about it. It had taken her to the end of the line. And at the end of the line there had been a man who said she would not need to barter again, and he had been right, and the life she had now was the evidence of his being right, and that was enough. That was more than enough. In the spring of 1879, Amity held its first proper celebration for the founding of the school, a genuine brick building now, with 2 rooms and a permanent teacher, and a small library that Margaret had assembled through a combination of donations and determined correspondence with publishers in the East. There was a ceremony, and then a gathering in the field beside the church, with tables set up and food contributed by half the town and children running in all directions. Thomas Dunlap, 5 years old and his father's height in miniature, ran with the other children with a focused joy that made Margaret laugh just watching him. Clara, 2.5 and deeply serious about everything, sat at the table with her small hands folded and watched the proceedings with the evaluating dark eyes that had never once stopped assessing the world. Calvin stood beside Margaret at the table and watched his children with the same expression she had first seen on that February dawn, the open, undefended happiness of a man who has received more than he asked for and knows it. "You built a good school," he said. "The town built it," she said. "You made the town want to," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her now, not at the children or the celebration, looking at her with the direct, clear attention that had never changed from the first morning in the fort, the look that saw her completely and found what it saw to be precisely right. "I love you," she said. She did not say it often, she was not a woman given to frequent declarations, but she said it when she meant it entirely, and she meant it entirely now. "I know," he said. And then, because he was Calvin and she would not have had him otherwise, "I love you too." They stood together in the April morning with their children running in the grass and the new school brick-red behind them and the mountains visible in the clean spring air, and the town of Amity moved around them with the productive noise of people who have chosen this place and are building something in it, and Margaret thought, this is what was at the end of the line. Not a fort, not a man, not a solution to a practical problem. This specific life with these specific people in this specific light. She had bartered her last quilt for passage to the end of the line, and the man at the end of the line had said she would not need to barter again. He had been right about the bartering, and he had been right about everything else, the steadiness and the patience and the practical love, the quilt they had made together from what was real, the home that was not a place but a way of being in a place. She was 38 years old. She was standing in the Oregon spring with her husband's hand finding hers. She was entirely, completely, properly home. The morning light fell across everything, and the mountains were very clear, And somewhere across the field Thomas Dunlap was shouting with the unbridled delight of a child who has discovered something excellent. And Clara turned her serious dark eyes toward her brother with the beginning of a smile that was going to be, when it fully arrived, exactly like her father's, private and warm and entirely real. And Margaret Dunlap, who had once stood at the edge of independence with nothing but a quilt and 37 cents, and a stubborn refusal to be finished, held her husband's hand in the April light and was glad, quietly, deeply, permanently glad, for every mile of the road that had brought her here.